Have you ever wondered why your deepest pain doesn't go away even after you've prayed? What if the struggle you're desperate to escape is the very tool God is using to reshape your soul? Stay until the end. You may never see your suffering the same way again. Pain is not a cosmic blunder. It is not a cruel coincidence, nor a misstep in the orchestration of your life. We often imagine our suffering as something to be edited out of the story, as if it were an error in the manuscript of God's will. But pain, as strange and uncomfortable as it may seem, is very often the ink with which the most critical parts of our soul's narrative are written. If we could view our lives from a higher vantage point, from the perspective of eternity rather than the temporal moment, we might begin to understand that pain does not stand outside of purpose, it stands directly inside of it. The God who numbers the hairs on our heads does not misplace the sorrows we carry. There is no rogue tear, no wasted heartbreak, no stray affliction. These are not divine oversights. They are deliberate tools in the hands of a craftsman who is both loving and relentless. We have perhaps been far too eager to judge pain by how it feels rather than by what it forms. We believe comfort is a sign of blessing and discomfort a sign of abandonment. But this theology collapses under the weight of any honest reading of Scripture or of life. The prophets suffered, the apostles bled. Even Christ himself, the Son of God, was not spared the breaking. The cup did not pass from him, it was handed to him, and he drank deeply. If the purest life the world has ever known walked a path marked with agony, what then makes us believe that pain is alien to those God loves? Could it be, in fact, that pain is often a strange and solemn mark of intimacy with him? To say that pain is purposeful is not to suggest that it is pleasant. It is not to deny the anguish it brings or the shadows it casts across our days. Suffering is real, it pierces, it confuses, it can leave us gasping for answers in the midnight of the soul. But even in that darkness, a thread runs through it all, a thread we often only perceive in hindsight. The pain we resist may be the very tool God is using to pry our fingers off what was never meant to sustain us. We are not always willing participants in this process. In truth, we rarely are. But God is less concerned with our comfort than he is with our transformation, and so he will, if necessary, allow pain to become the scalpel that cuts away our pride, our illusions, our self-sufficiency. There is a terrifying beauty in this. Pain removes the shallow comforts we once mistook for foundations. It exposes the brittle scaffolding of our self-made identity and reveals how little we truly control. But it is precisely in that unraveling that something new begins. Stripped of distractions, we may finally hear what we once ignored. We may finally see what we once refused to confront. And in those vulnerable spaces, God begins his deeper work, not simply altering our circumstances, but altering us. Pain, then, is not the enemy, nor is it accidental. It is appointed, it is allowed, not because God delights in our suffering, but because he sees what lies on the other side of it. We often think the pain is where things fall apart, but it may very well be where things begin to come together, not according to our design, but his. And so pain, uninvited, unwelcome, uncomfortable, becomes a strangely sacred space. It reminds us that we are not in control. It reminds us that we are finite, that we bleed, that we break. But in that breaking, a truer strength can be born. The very things we once prayed to be delivered from may be the very things delivering us. For if God is sovereign, and he is, then nothing in our lives, not even our suffering, is without meaning. It has not slipped through his fingers. It has passed through them. We often come to God with the quiet hope that he might improve us. We ask him to polish what is already present, to smooth the rough edges of our character, to refine our existing selves while leaving our essential structure intact. We envision the spiritual life as a kind of moral renovation, a gentler tongue, a more patient heart, perhaps a softer spirit, but rarely do we imagine that God's aim is demolition and rebuilding. Yet that is precisely what hardship often reveals, that God is not content with merely reshaping our behavior. He is after our being. He is not refining a surface. He is remaking the substance. And the process of remaking is far more invasive, far more painful, and far more glorious than we had imagined. To reshape something is to alter its appearance or adjust its posture. It suggests a bending, a stretching, a redirection. It implies that the original material is good enough, just in need of adjustment. But to remake something is to break it down, to disassemble it entirely, to begin again with the same substance, but a wholly new design. God is not in the business of cosmetic repairs. He is not a craftsman of veneers. He is the potter who smashes the flawed vessel and begins again at the wheel, not because he is cruel, but because he sees that the cracks run deeper than we know. And so he allows the pressure, the weight, the sorrow, the trial, not to crush us arbitrarily, but to bring about a kind of holy undoing, the kind that precedes resurrection. Hardship, when seen through divine eyes, is not simply a moral test or a spiritual inconvenience. It is the context in which the old self is buried and the new one born. There are things in us that will not come loose under comfort. Pride clings tightly in prosperity. Self-reliance thrives in ease. Illusions of control and sufficiency build their thrones when life is soft. But when the furnace is heated, when life is stripped of its familiar comforts, when our plans are shattered and our hearts are heavy with unanswered questions, then, and often only then, do we finally hold still long enough for the deeper work to begin. The scaffolding collapses, the masks fall, and in the rubble God starts again, not with judgment, but with mercy, not with punishment, but with purpose. This remaking is not always visible to others. It happens in the hidden places, in the silence of lonely prayers, in the nights soaked with tears, in the mornings when hope feels foreign. But over time, something shifts. The soul that once grasped for control begins to surrender. The person who once relied on their own wisdom begins to seek a wisdom not their own. The heart that was once satisfied with shallow religion begins to ache for real communion. This is not surface change. This is not a reshaping. This is the recreation of a person who has passed through the fire and been changed not around the edges, but at the core. The world will not applaud this process. In fact, it will often misunderstand it. It will look at suffering and see only loss. It will view hardship as misfortune, as something to be escaped or denied or numbed. But God is not bound by worldly definitions of success or happiness. He allows what he allows not to harm us, but to make us whole, not whole as the world defines it, but whole as heaven requires. The goal is not merely to produce better men and women, it is to make saints, children fitted for eternal fellowship with the one who formed them. And this divine remaking rarely happens without the strange and sacred tool of suffering. God will not be content to improve what must be replaced. He will not bless the self-made image we present to the world if it hinders the birth of the person he knows we were meant to become. The hardship you endure may not be the thing God uses to straighten your path, but to give you entirely new feet with which to walk a different path altogether. His purpose is not to reform, but to resurrect. And resurrection always follows death, the death of pride, the death of self, the death of every false identity we built without him. In that space, where everything we clung to has been taken away, we begin to see what we were always meant to be. Not merely reformed sinners, but new creations. not polished statues, but living temples, not survivors of life's trials, but remade vessels of His glory. There is a peculiar dullness that settles upon the soul in times of ease. When life moves smoothly and comforts abound, we become strangely deaf, not because God is silent, but because we have filled the air with our own noise. The applause of success, the hum of routine, the soft lullabies of self-assurance, all these drown out the subtler voice of the divine. We mistake the absence of trouble for the presence of clarity, but clarity does not often dwell in the sunlit fields of our own making. It is in the wilderness, in the aching silence of our deepest questions, that our spiritual ears are forced open. Suffering, as unwelcome as it is, serves not merely as a disruption, but as an invitation to hear what we had previously ignored. It tears through the veil of distractions and makes us aware, sometimes painfully aware, of how long we've gone without truly listening. It is one thing to hear God when life is agreeable and prayers are answered on time. It is another thing entirely to listen when heaven seems quiet, when answers delay, and when everything familiar begins to fracture. In those moments, the soul no longer has the luxury of casual belief. The shallow phrases that once passed as faith dissolve in the heat of suffering. What remains is a raw, trembling openness, a desperate attentiveness to the voice that speaks behind the veil. And though the words may not come immediately, though there may be a season where the silence feels like abandonment, something shifts. The ears of the heart, long closed by self-sufficiency and dulled by the clamor of a comfortable life, begin to twitch again, sensitive not to what is loud, but to what is real. This is no accident. There is design in the silence that suffering brings. When every human solution fails, when the routines fall apart, and when the soul is too weary to pretend, it is then that God speaks with the most piercing clarity. Not always in the way we expect, not in thunder or spectacle. Sometimes it is no more than a whisper, but it is a whisper that slices through the fog like lightning. Suffering clears space. It sweeps the crowded hallways of our inner life and drives us into solitude, not the lonely kind, but the kind in which divine speech becomes possible again. It is not that God was absent before, it is that our ears were full of lesser voices. This is why the saints and prophets of old were so often acquainted with grief. Their suffering did not disqualify them from hearing God, it tuned them to Him. Their pain was not a barrier, but a doorway. Think of Elijah, broken under the broom tree, hearing God not in the wind or fire, but in the still small voice. Think of Job, silenced by affliction, finally saying, "I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes see you." Pain has a way of stripping us of illusion. It silences the ego, it humbles the intellect, it quiets the endless chatter of our modern minds, and makes room for a truer, deeper form of hearing, not with the ears, but with the spirit. This awakening is not immediate, it is rarely welcomed. At first, suffering stuns, it disorients, it can lead to anger, confusion, even despair. But as the noise of resistance dies down, as the soul becomes still, not by will but by weariness, a space opens, a listening begins. It is the kind of listening that doesn't demand answers, but longs for presence. And in that longing, in that sacred quiet, we begin to discern the movement of God, not always in words, but in impressions, in conviction, in comfort that cannot be traced to any earthly source. The voice is no longer competing for attention. It becomes the only voice we want to hear. Suffering then becomes a paradoxical gift, not because it is good in itself, but because of what it exposes and awakens. It shows us how deaf we have become to what matters most. It reveals the fragile scaffolding of our beliefs and calls us back to the foundation. In that returning, in that aching search for God in the silence, our spiritual senses are reawakened. The pain opens what pride had closed. The heart, broken and bewildered, learns again what it means to listen, not for what we want to hear, but for what is true, what is eternal, what is holy. There are places in life that feel like endings, seasons so thick with sorrow, confusion, or silence that one cannot help but believe something precious has died and will not return. We describe such times as being buried, as if hope itself were laid in a tomb, sealed behind stone. These are not simply days of discomfort. They are experiences of disorientation, where the soul gropes for light and finds only darkness. We imagine that nothing good could be happening here. We whisper to ourselves that this is wasted time, lost time, broken time. But what if the very sensation of burial is not the end of life, but the beginning of something deeper? What if the unseen, silent places where we feel forgotten, hidden, entombed, are in fact the secret soil where the most profound growth takes place? Seeds do not grow in sunlight alone. They require burial. The gardener knows this well. A seed must first disappear beneath the soil, hidden from view, surrendered to the dark. To the unknowing observer, this looks like a kind of death. Something once full of potential is now lowered into the earth, covered, silent, forgotten. But the gardener waits, not with despair, but with expectation. He knows what the soil hides. He knows that death is only the doorway to life. And so it is with us. God, the divine gardener, does not bury his children in despair. He plants them in purpose. But to us, who see so little and feel so much, it does not feel like planting. It feels like loss. It is in these moments of hiddenness that God does his most sacred work. We cry out to be delivered, not realizing that the darkness around us is not a coffin, but a womb. The transformation taking place is quiet, unseen, slow. Growth beneath the surface is not flashy. There is no applause for roots. And yet, without roots, there will be no fruit. The most stable, resilient lives are those that have spent time in deep, silent places, where faith was forged without witnesses, where obedience was chosen without reward, where love for God grew without the encouragement of circumstance. These are the souls who emerge not with shallow enthusiasm, but with enduring strength. This is why our deepest growth so often takes place in the valleys, not the mountaintops. Mountaintops are for glimpses, for praise, for wonder. But valleys are for digging, for maturing, for becoming. When everything around us has been stripped away, when the spotlight fades, when the applause stops, when even the familiar comforts of God's presence feel withdrawn, we find ourselves reduced to the raw core of who we really are. And there, in that stripped and silent place, God begins to build again, not upon the illusion, but upon the truth, not upon what we think we are, but upon who He intends us to become. The feeling of being buried is rarely welcomed. No one chooses it. No one prays for it. But it is often precisely in that dark and lonely soil where the soul breaks open, where humility begins, where hunger for God deepens, and where the shallow foundations of our former selves are abandoned. We become real there, not polished, not presentable, but real. And the truth is, there are certain strengths that can only grow underground. There are certain virtues, patience, endurance, hope that cannot be taught through pleasure. They are born through pressure, through waiting, through surrender. The paradox of the Christian life is that burial often precedes resurrection. Not just once, but again and again. We are buried in failure, in grief, in longing, in unanswered questions. And in each of these graves, something old is laid down, and something new waits to rise. But we do not see it at first. We only feel the weight of the soil, the absence of light, the ache of waiting. We feel forgotten by others, sometimes even by God. But what we mistake for abandonment is often preparation. What feels like exile may be cultivation. We want to sprout, but God wants us to root. We want escape, but God desires endurance. He is not in a hurry, because he is not building something temporary. He is forming something eternal. And eternity takes time, it takes depth, and it often begins right where we feel most buried. We often come to faith with the unspoken hope that belief will shield us from the harsher edges of life. We look upon Christ and imagine that following him should lead us into green pastures and beside still waters, safely, gently, quietly. But if we are truly to be conformed to the image of Christ, then we must not only walk with him in triumph, but follow him through trial. For he was not shaped in palaces, nor crowned in comfort. He was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, formed in the fires of rejection, obedience, hunger, temptation, and suffering. And if the goal of God in our lives is to make us like his Son, not merely admired from afar, but mirrored from within, then we must come to see that trials are not detours or accidents, but sacred tools in divine hands, pressing us, shaping us, bending us into something we could never become by ease alone. There is a divine violence in transformation. We are not merely improved, we are remade, and this remaking is not painless. The old self resists, the flesh claws at comfort and flees from fire. Yet fire is exactly what God uses, not to destroy, but to refine. Just as metal is purified through heat, so the impurities of pride, fear, selfishness, and unbelief are drawn to the surface when life presses hardest against us. In trials, the mask drops. We no longer have the strength to pretend. What is hidden is revealed, and what is broken is brought into the open. Yet it is there, in that exposed, trembling space, that the Spirit begins his finest work, not fixing what we show the world, but reshaping what lies beneath it. Every tear becomes a drop of water on the potter's wheel. Every disappointment becomes pressure in his hands. And all the while, he is forming something that bears the contours of Christ himself. To be shaped into Christ's likeness is not to gain a halo or adopt a religious vocabulary. It is to carry a cross. It is to love those who wound, to pray when weary, to forgive the unforgivable, to endure without applause, to trust without clarity. And none of this is natural. None of this can be manufactured by sheer will. It must be carved into us. It must be beaten into the grain of our being through the repeated friction of trial after trial, refining us not only in what we believe, but in how we live, think, and respond. The Christ-likeness we so often admire in others, gentleness under pressure, peace in pain, humility in power, was not acquired cheaply. It was forged in trials, in loss, in delays that stretched the soul thin, in wounds that healed slowly and often in silence. This is the path of formation. It is long, it is narrow, and yet it is holy. Sometimes we cry out for the trial to be removed, not realizing that it is the very pressure shaping us into the kind of person we've longed to become. We want the outcome without the furnace. We want the glory of Christ without the groaning of Gethsemane. But God is not interested in shallow resemblance. He is after a deep internal alignment with the life and heart of his Son. And that cannot happen in the shallows. Trials take us into the depths. They test not only our faith but our foundations. They reveal whether we are built on rock or sand. And when we are not, they offer us the grace of rebuilding, not alone, but with the master carpenter. The shaping process is rarely visible to others. They may see the struggle, but not the sanctification. They may hear the sighs, but not recognize the sanctity being born in secret. But over time, something shifts. A gentleness replaces the sharp edge. A patience softens the hurried soul. A strength emerges, not the strength of defiance, but of surrender. And this quiet transformation, this slow becoming, is the unmistakable imprint of Christ being formed in us, not by sermon or sentiment, but by trial, through the harsh kindness of a God who refuses to leave us unchanged, who is more committed to our holiness than our happiness, more invested in our likeness to Christ than in our likeness to the world. There is a kind of sorrow that sits so deeply in the soul that it becomes difficult to imagine a world without it. It clings to the edges of everything, every memory, every moment of silence, every act of worship that now feels hollow. It becomes, for a season, the language of the heart, the atmosphere of the inner life. And yet, the strange promise of the Christian journey is that this sorrow, heavy, real, unbearable as it seems, is not the final word. It is not a tombstone, but a seed. For in the great mystery of God's redemptive work, sorrow does not merely end, it is transformed. That which once pressed us down will rise again in a different form. That which once silenced our songs will in time become the very reason we sing. But the path from grief to glory, from ache to anthem, is not quick and is never clean. It winds through nights of silence, through days of unanswered questions, through the long, slow grieving of what once was and can no longer be. In this transformation, God does not simply erase the pain. He weaves it. He takes the raw threads of suffering, the heartbreak, the loss, the silence, the waiting, and braids them into melodies that we could never have sung without first having wept. The soul that has tasted sorrow deeply begins to hear music differently. It understands joy not as a denial of pain, but as something born from it, shaped by it. There is a depth, a richness in the songs sung on the other side of suffering that no untouched voice can mimic. It is not artificial gladness, not naive cheer. It is the kind of joy that still trembles slightly with memory, the kind that knows full well what it cost to arrive at the morning. This is not the joy of ignorance. It is the joy of resurrection. Heaven, we are told, will be a place of no more tears, but the memory of those tears will not be erased. Instead, they will become part of the story, transfigured, reinterpreted, rewritten by the author who wastes nothing. One day, every tear that fell in secret will be accounted for, not just with comfort, but with meaning. God will not simply say, "There, there," and wipe them away as though they never mattered. He will show us what they became, and perhaps, just perhaps, we will see that those very sorrows were the ink He used to write our songs. Not songs we would have chosen to sing, not melodies we would have asked to carry, but songs nonetheless, full of beauty, full of weight, full of the unmistakable sound of grace. This is the slow work of redemption. It does not bypass the pit. It leads us through it. And though the journey may stretch long and the valley may feel endless, there is a promise that hums beneath the sorrow, a quiet refrain that refuses to be extinguished. This will not be wasted. The morning that now seems endless will become the morning we never thought would come. The ashes we wear today will become the oil of gladness we anoint others with tomorrow. The wounds we carry will become the wisdom we offer. Even our silence will someday become a psalm. Not because the pain didn't matter, but because God is able to make it matter differently. There will be a time, perhaps not in this life, but certainly in the life to come, when we will look back and see how the most broken chapters were the ones that made us sing the loudest. Not because they were sweet, but because God met us there. He did not abandon us in the sorrow. He was shaping the lyrics in the dark. And when the music finally rises, when the full symphony of grace is played, we will recognize the notes. We will recognize the minor chords that once felt like torment and realize they were always leading us toward resolution. What felt like the end was only the introduction. What once silenced us will become the reason we raise our voices. What we thought would drown us will become the very river that carries our song, and though it was born in grief, it will end in glory, echoing not just through eternity, but through every part of us that was ever touched by pain.